All right, I guess it's time to start then. Everybody got quiet all of a sudden. So, if you would go ahead and take your Bibles and turn to the book of Ruth, we're going to jump back in with chapter 4 and pick up where we left off last week. And so, in Ruth chapter 4, we're in the last chapter of the book of Ruth. And so, just to give a recap, we have the start of chapter 4 where Boaz goes into the city. He goes to the city gates and he's looking for the kinsman redeemer that is closer than he is. So there is a redeemer who is closer, family-wise, to Naomi, who has the first right to purchase the field. But if you purchase the field, he's going to have to fulfill his levirate duty and marry Ruth and then strive to give Naomi a son to replace the two that she's lost. The close to kin says he simply cannot do it for his own inheritance sake. And so Boaz says, I'll redeem the field. I will marry Ruth. I'll take care of Naomi. And so before the elders of the city and also all the individuals who are there at the city gate, Boaz does this. And they do the ancient custom of exchanging a sandal, because that was the way that you solidified a contract in the ancient world, at least in Israel at this time. And so Boaz declares that he's going to redeem Naomi, and the elders witness that, and then they give a blessing. And then we get to verses 13 through 17. So let's just read chapter 4, verses 13 through 17, and kind of pick back up where we left off last week. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went into her, and the Lord gave to her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age, for your daughter-in-law, who loves you, is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, A son has been born to Naomi. And they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now these are the generations of Perez. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. But here we have in verses 13 through 17 that Boaz and Ruth are married, and the Lord gives her conception. And we talked about how last week, how that indicates that most likely Ruth was barren. She was married before to her previous husband, but did not have any children. In the ancient world, that's kind of uncommon, especially as brides are young and contraception is not a thing. And so it seems to me that she stands in a similar situation as the matriarchs of Israel, like Sarah and Rebecca and others who had fertility issues. And it said the Lord gave her conception. The son's name is Obed, which means he serves or he works. And he is given to Naomi, who sits on his lap, and she becomes his nurse. We talked about how the Hebrew word there is not wet nurse. Naomi is too old for that. But she does become his teacher, his provider. It's more than just his live-in grandmother. They say, your daughter-in-law who loves you is better than 7 sons. The interesting thing is, and we talked about genealogy. I don't think I've got it on this screen here, but let's look at verses 18 through 22. It says, Now these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Aminadab. Aminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered David. And so here we have 10 men, 5 pre-Moses and 5 post-Moses. It's kind of similar to what you see in the book of Matthew. In Matthew, you have 14, 14, 14. Right? And so we can see in the book of Matthew that there are some generations who are not listed, but Matthew's doing, and skipping generations in ancient genealogies is not a big deal, right? It's not atypical. It's commonly done. But in Matthew, you get 14, 14, 14, and here in the book of Ruth, you get 5 and 5. You get 5 before Moses and 5 after Moses, which is kind of interesting. And so Elimelech means that my God is king. And so let's talk a little bit about genealogy, I guess you would say. And so if this is correct and generations are not skipped, and let's just say that Salmon, right, is the prince of Judah, and that he is the one who marries Rahab, right? Rahab is a Canaanite. That would make Boaz what? Half, right? And so he would be, Boaz is half Canaanite and half Israelite, right? In the tribe of Judah. Who does Boaz marry? Ruth. It's going to feel bad. It's like, oh no, we spent 4 weeks on this and I don't know who Boaz married, right? Boaz married Ruth, right? Ruth is from where? Moab, which is not an Israelite. So Obed has a Canaanite mother and a dad who's only half Israelite. So Obed is technically what? 3/4 Canaanite and 1/4 Israelite. That's kind of interesting, is it not? Here you have the grandfather of the king of Israel, who's more Canaanite than he is Israelite. Especially with the Mosaic commandment to not marry, right, the people of the land. So it's just kind of interesting. Let's just say for, just to have a little fun, right? We don't know the nationality, or at least fully, who Obed marries. But let's say Obed marries a full-fledged Israelite, okay? He's 1/4 Israelite, 3/4 Canaanite, and he marries a full-fledged Israelite. That means that Jesse, the father of David, is going to be 5/8 Israelite, and he's going to be 3/8 Canaanite, right? If his mother is fully Israelite. That also means that if Jesse's wife is fully Israelite, that David is at the least 81% Israelite, 13th, 16th, right? You're like, what is this, Matt? I don't know what it means. I'm just having fun with you guys. And so let's just say the most that David is 81% Israelite and 19% Canaanite, right? So King David is actually, basically you say 20% Canaanite at the least. And honestly, with the intermarriage between the people of the land and the Israelites, he's probably more. So he's probably somewhere between 20 and 40% Canaanite, which is just kind of interesting, I think. And so, but here you have this genealogy, and I think you get the purpose for the book of Ruth here in the fact that Elimelech means my God is king, right? And during this time frame, you have this transition between the end of the judges and the establishment of the monarchy, right? Because we talked about this during this time frame. Samuel is already a prophet, a priest, and a judge, right? And so Samuel is going to be the one who is going to anoint Saul as the first king of Israel, and then Samuel is actually going to anoint David to be the next king, right? And so Elimelech means my God is king. When the people of the nation declare they want a king like the nations around them, Samuel gets really sad, right? And what does God tell Samuel? We're reading ahead. But anybody remember what God tells Samuel? He says, they haven't rejected you. They have rejected me from what? Being their king, right? So it's kind of interesting that David's ancestor's name is Elimelech, which is my God is king, right? And so here you have the book of Ruth takes place during the time of the judges. The Judges and Ruth are written roughly about the same time by Samuel the prophet, right? And so here you get the story. So we know the story, so it's hard for us. But imagine you're reading this for the very first time, right? Samuel, the prophet of God, has written this book. It's being read to you. You're invested into it. You learn about Ruth and Naomi and this guy named Boaz. And they seem like just kind of abstract people in Judah that doesn't really make any difference to anything. And then you get to the end of the book and you realize, oh, wait a minute. That's the new king's ancestors, right? And then you go back and you look at the book of Judges, which is written at the same time. And as we mentioned before, when David becomes king, does everybody accept David as being the king? There's actually a civil war after David becomes king, led by the tribe of Benjamin, right? Because the first king was from the tribe of Benjamin. They think that one of Saul's sons ought to be the king, right? So there's a little civil war that takes place. And you get these two books, Judges and Ruth. And in the book of Judges, what does the men of the tribe of Benjamin do? They rebel, right? They rebel. They fight against the nation. There's that atrocity that takes place, right, with the Levite's wife. Remember, Judges 19-21, all the men of Benjamin except 600 are killed, right? And so Anne is from the very town that who is from? Saul. So where that atrocity takes place is the homeland of Saul. So you've got Saul's great-grandfather during this time frame who's actually fighting against Israel for the sake of men who violate and kill an innocent woman, right? What's David's great-grandfather during this time? It's Boaz. He's showing loving kindness to Ruth and to Naomi, right? which dynastic family do you want ruling over you? Right? Saul or David? Right? So it's kind of interesting. So this at the end is not just some throwaway. So at the time when David becomes king, and we know when this is written because it's got to be after the judges, it has to be written after the monarchy and also before Jerusalem becomes conquered by David in 1004 BC. So you know it's taking place earlier in his reign. And so it's kind of interesting when you see this. This is not just a story about Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz. This is also a story about God's providential love and care during this wicked time of the judges, establishing a lineage and a line that's going to bring about the true king of Israel, right? Which also makes sense for what down the road. This also happens to be the lineage of the true king of Jesus, right? So not only is God providing the true king of Israel, he's also providing the true king of all mankind, right? And so, great. Todd?
I was just going to say, you talked about Boaz marrying a Canaanite. If you even go to Judah, the children that Tamar was supposed to marry came from a Canaanite woman.
Mm-hmm.
Tamar was probably not a Jewish herself, and Pharez is her son. So even Pharez was not 100% Jewish. So that whole line was a mixed bag of both Jew and Gentile.
Oh, yeah. There's a lot of intermarriage going on that we're probably, that we can see from the text, and probably a lot more that we don't know. I mean, even Bathsheba's first husband was Hittite, right? And so when you see it everywhere. So good. All right, so some conclusions for chapter 4. We didn't make it here, but this is also a part of the conclusions for the whole text, is that God is king, right? It's kind of interesting. The first man who's mentioned in the book of Ruth, Elimelech, means God is king, right? And so God is the king overall. Number 2, that God is redeemer. And so the whole story is about Naomi and Ruth trying to find a Goel, a kinsman redeemer, and ultimately the redeemer of the nation, right? So think about this from someone reading this during the time of David. You have all these civil wars taking place. You have Saul, who's not been a good king, and now you have a king after God's own heart. And so God is redeeming the nation through a new king. Number 3, God as a provider. God provides for Boaz, right? We don't read of children or a wife, and at the end of the story, Boaz gets a wife. He provides for Ruth with a husband and children, provides for Naomi with status, prestige, and offspring. And number 4, God as the immovable mover, right? And so all these things take place in the story that reveal that God is at work in their lives. And so that leads us to going on finally with our last lesson, which is Ruth in review. Before I give my list, what are some things that you thought was interesting through our study in the book of Ruth, or things that stood out to you? And feel free to steal some of mine that I'll talk about later. Yes, I was trying to figure out where that came from. Yeah, loyalty, right? Can anybody tell me what the Hebrew word for loyalty is that is used in this book a couple of times? Chesed, right? Yeah, chesed, whatever you want to call it. But yeah, so that word chesed is mentioned several times in the text, right? And it means kindness, loyalty, or compassion. And I think you're right. I think that's one of the main themes throughout the book, is the fact that you have these individuals in the story, all of whom are suffering in some type of way, showing each other kindness and compassion and loyalty, right? And God doing the exact same thing to them. And so I do think it's about loyalty. Did Ruth have to go and leave her family to go to Jerusalem? Bethlehem? No, she didn't, right? And so even when Boaz is talking to her, he says, I've heard about your chesed, your loyalty to your mother-in-law, right? So absolutely. I think that's a great one. And even Boaz. So Boaz admits that he wants to marry Ruth in chapter 3, right? And Boaz could technically marry her on the side without going to the closer kinsman. It had been considered wrong to do so, but he could have done it, right? But he shows his loyalty to his family and to his kinsmen and saying, no, we're going to go through the proper channels and do this the right way, right? And so, yeah, I think that's a great point. Anyone else?
Well, he also showed loyalty to the law,
Mm-hmm.
which is thrown in the face if you read Judges. opposite of what most men were doing during that time.
Yeah. I like what Todd said there. He shows loyalty to the law, right? In the book of Judges, we've talked about this quite a few times, but it's a very dark time that even the judges themselves don't act very good. And everyone does what is right in his own eyes, said at least 3 times in the book of Judges, and 7 times in the book of Judges, it says they did what was evil and forsook the Lord. And yet you see Boaz, and the first thing you see Boaz say in the story is, may the Lord bless you, right? And he invokes the name of Yahweh throughout the entirety of the book, right? And so he stands in direct contrast with what the average male that we see in the book of Judges is doing. And that's important because Ruth takes place during the time of the Judges. It's the very first line of the book, and it's there for a reason, right? And I also think there's some little politicking going on too between the very close of Judges and how awful the Benjamites act, which is Saul's hometown. Come on now. It's not just the tribe of Benjamin. It's the hometown of Saul, right? That's his people versus the hometown of David, right? And so that's not coincidental, right? So good. Anyone else have something from the book of Judges?
I think the book of Ruth.
Or Ruth, yes. Or either one. Yeah. We'll go with Ruth.
I think Naomi was very wise in guiding Ruth through all of this. She just had a lot of wisdom.
Yeah. Yeah. Naomi is hurt, but even in Naomi, you still see an amount of faith that's there, right? And so when she comes back, she sees the Lord as being the one who's brought this calamity upon her, right? And then later in the book, she recognizes the Lord as the one who's given her this opportunity of being redeemed, right? And so, absolutely. Craig, did you have your hand up? Or was that Tim?
I was just gonna say, it's a real life illustration of Romans 8:28 playing out. You know, she doesn't understand. She says, I went out full and God brought me back, and now I'm Mara, I'm bitter. God's been bitter against me, and yet she didn't realize that God was working behind the scenes through the life they were living, the choices they made. Just like when she said, "Well, go out and work," and Ruth goes out and works, and she falls on that particular piece of land. She is introduced to him. It's God using our choices, our life, to bring about His purpose and His will. And sometimes we don't understand what's going on and what's happening behind the scenes, but we're not alone, and God is still there. He's still working. I think that is a good illustration of what Romans 8:28 is all about.
Yeah, I think that's a great takeaway. And even John 10:10, Jesus says, I came that may have life and have it abundantly, right? And you read Ruth chapter 1 at the end, and you think, ooh, that's kind of a poor attitude by Naomi right there. And you're like, yeah, but you've had that attitude numerous times in your own life too, buddy. And so it's so clear on somebody else, right? You read it to somebody else, and it's so clear, right? But we're different. We all have justification as to why our situation is different, right? And so, but yeah, I think that's a great point, and showing that He is there, right? And the phrase "it just so happened," depending on your English translation, but "just so happened" occurs about 3 or 4 times. By the end of the book, you're like, nah, it wouldn't happenstance, right? It's providential care. Good. Anyone else? Todd?
I always read Ruth. I always think of it as a way of also showing that even in the prophets of old, when the kingdoms were falling apart and getting taken away, it shows you that when God says all men were doing what was right in their own sight, it doesn't really mean all men. It just means that's the generality. Because He shows Boaz is trying to do the right thing before God.
Yeah.
And so sometimes when we read stuff about what's happening, we kind of think of like Elijah, like, man, everyone's just going bad. No. There were good people at this time trying to do the right thing. It's just they were a small group of people.
Yeah. And you see that, and that's why I think Ruth is such a breath of fresh air, right? You read the book of Judges, and it's like, man, everybody is just so bad. And then you read Ruth, and you're like, okay, this is actually really nice. And it's at the same time frame, right? Which also kind of, throws you for a loop. But it goes to show you that, they're still good if you're looking for it, right? And the same is true today, right? Good. Right? Perfect. Yes.
Can you shed some light on how the inheritance of it? Because I mean, it mentions about now that she had a son,
Mm-hmm.
who had a son, it brought about the inheritance, even though he was not considered, was it wrong?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But how did that fit in?
Yeah, he would have inherited Elimelech's land portion. And so the land portion goes to the families that go into the land of Canaan, and then that gets divided up between sons, basically. And so the land gets divided amongst sons. And so Elimelech's portion, however big it was, his two sons die. So what happens to his portion? Well, if it doesn't go back to anybody, it's going to be absorbed probably to his closest kin, which is going to be the individual that Boaz talks to in chapter 4, right? And so this way, Obed is going to become the beneficiary and be an inherent. He will not inherit any of Boaz's land, but he will inherit Elimelech's land. Does that make sense? And so basically it's seen as staying in the family because you're all males from the same lineage eventually. Does that make sense? And so it's not how we do things, but it made sense to them.
I didn't know if he'd be an heir to the things in Naomi because when he purchased the land, it's more strictly the land through Boaz now.
Yeah, it would be Elimelech's land that Boaz redeemed when he married Ruth. So good. Brother Williams?
Question.
Sure.
So, in the text, when Ruth is being compared to 7 sons, or better than 7 sons, that the Hebrew word for 7 is also the same word for perfect.
Mhm.
Is it also could it be, Ruth is better than perfect son, or is it only a numerical?
Yeah, it's a phrase. So basically, it's a phrase that was common during this time frame to I'm trying to think of a phrase. Like it's almost like there are some countries today, like I think in Russia today, if you have a certain amount of sons, you get a title in Russia and you don't get to pay. You don't have to pay taxes anymore. But it's not just Russia. There's several Eastern European countries where it's totally. Are you familiar with this? No? I don't know if Ukraine is like that too. But there are several countries in Eastern Europe where if you have 4 sons or 6 sons or whatever it is, you don't have to pay property. You don't have to pay taxes anymore. And so you're given a special title. This is kind of like that, right? This idea that, the perfect Israelite woman has 7 sons, and so it's kind of like it's a cultural expression, right? And so, what's that, Corley?
Hannah's husband says something like that too, right?
Elkanah, I'm not sure, but we're fixing to do 1st and 2nd Samuel, so that
He says, I'm better than like 10 sons or something to you.
I'm better than 10. Oh yeah, when she cries.
Treats Hannah.
Yeah, when she cries. Okay, she cries because she doesn't have any children, and it says Elkanah's heart is sad. It says, I'm not better than 10 sons to you. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that same kind of expression. Yeah. Sheila?
I just had a footnote in my Bible about the 7, better than 7 sons. It said that 7 was considered a number of completeness, and to have 7 sons was the epitome of the best you could have.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's playing off that idea, right? And so, yeah, good. All right. So just a few things that I put down as takeaways. Number 1 is Ruth as an example of a matriarch. And so she is like Sarah, Rebecca, and Rachel in the fact that she has problems conceiving. And she's also like Tamar that Todd mentioned before. Tamar was the matriarch of the entire tribe of Judah, technically. And she was a foreigner. She was a hard worker. She did not have self-pity or complain about her situation. She cared for the needs of others, like her mother-in-law. She shows chesed, or loyalty and kindness in her actions towards others. And God blesses her with a husband and children. It's also interesting that the word that is used for worthy is in Proverbs 31, and Ruth is the only woman in the Bible that has that word attributed to her. So that Proverbs 31, the only woman who has that same moniker attribute mentioned is Ruth, which is kind of interesting. Number 2, that God accepts people from all nations. And so Israel was supposed to be a light unto the nations, Isaiah 42, verse 6, and to draw all people in to have a relationship with him. And so we see Ruth is a lot like her predecessor Rahab. right? The one who, shielded the spies and then eventually marries, right, Boaz's dad, right? So technically her own mother-in-law through Boaz. And so even though they were not to intermarry with the people, there were provisions in the law of Moses to proselytize, to convert people. And in fact, God says that he had chosen the nation of Israel, not because they were strong or smart, but because they were weak, so he could show his power through the nation. And they were supposed to be a holy people to mirror the holiness of God and to draw the other nations into them, which didn't happen, but that was the goal. And so the same is said of the church, that Jesus is the light of the world, John 8:12. Jesus tells us that we are also the light of the world, Matthew 5:14-16, that we are to walk in the light, 1 John 1:7, and to be children of light, Ephesians 5:8, that those may see us and also draw near to God as well. The third thing that I see is the importance of chesed, showing loyalty, kindness, and compassion. And we've talked about that a lot, but I think it's interesting. In James 1:27, James says, religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to visit orphans in their affliction and to keep oneself unstained from the world. Matthew 25:40, Jesus says, truly I say to you, as you did to one of the least of these, my brothers, you did to me. And so Christianity is not just about being baptized. Being baptized is very important, obviously, to get into Christ, into his church. But you have all these lists, like in Galatians chapter 5, and Colossians 3, and Romans 12, about, okay, now that you have been baptized into Christ, what are you supposed to be doing? Christianity is a religion of doing things. And this idea of kindness being mentioned over and over again in these lists of what a Christian is supposed to look like, right? And so you see that about the importance of this kindness and loyalty and compassion, and how we're supposed to have that with each other as Christians. Number 4, leaving things behind. Leaving things behind or people behind to follow God and become a part of his people is still something today. Ruth had to leave behind everything that she ever knew. Her homeland, her customs, her religion, her family. She had to leave it all behind in order to become a part of the people of God, which she did. Hebrews 11:10 says the same thing about Abraham. It says, for he was looking forward to a city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. And so Abraham had to leave his home country. He had to leave his father in order to follow God, right? And so does God still require us to leave things behind to follow him? There's nobody in this room here tonight who is a faithful Christian who's not had to leave something behind to be a Christian. People, relationships, hobbies, words, friends, everybody here has left something to follow Christ, right? And so that's still true. Jesus talks about that in Luke 14. If you love your mom and your dad, right? If you love your children more than me, you can be my disciple, right? Because you got to be willing to take up your cross, follow me, and leave things behind. Number 5, God's loving providential hand in our lives. And so one of the beautiful things about the book of Ruth is to see how God lovingly provides for Ruth and Naomi, and also for Boaz too, from his perspective, because we don't read about any children or lineage that he has. And the reason that I like the book of Ruth is because there's no miraculous event, except maybe if she is barren, her having a child. But I mean, there's no burning bush. There's no river or body of water being split in two. There's no pillar of fire. There's no iron axe head floating in the river. There's none of that stuff, right? And yet, throughout the entirety of the book, you see God working through mundane, everyday actions to bless these individuals and to make their life better. I think the same is true for us. I don't think that the miraculous gift of the Holy Spirit, as we see in the book of Acts, is still with us. I haven't seen no burning bush or floating axe head, but I do believe in God's providential loving care, that he takes care of us and that he is working in our lives, the lives of others, for that Romans 8:28, that all things work together for good. In James 1:17, he's the giver of every good and perfect gift. In John 10:10, that I came that I may have life more abundantly. And then number 6, responding with initiative to God's providence. And so you see here God's loving providential care throughout the book, but you also see these individuals responding to God's providential care. God is opening doors, and they're taking the initiative to run through those doors, right? So this is not a book about, God will take care of everything. Don't worry about it, right? This is no, you do what's right and you work hard and God's going to open doors. And when he does, you run through it, right? And so, which I think is a good lesson for all of us today. And so, any closing thoughts or comments before we close in prayer? But Don?
I've got a note here. The redemption of youth of Ruth ultimately leads to the birth of King David. Why did you didn't mention that?
I did, Brother
I
Don.
missed it.
I did.
I must have been reading something.
You had too much soup. What happened? No, I'm just playing. I'm playing. And so, but to reiterate, and I think that is one of the big lessons in the book of Ruth that is oftentimes overlooked, is I think the entire thing is revolving around God's providential love and care in bringing about King David, and this idea that without Ruth, you don't get David, right? And so a first-time reader reading this book is like, oh, this is a really cool story. And then you get to the very last paragraph, and you're like, what? The new king, right? The new king is the one who's the grandchild or the grandchild of this union, right? And so I think in the backdrop of the book of Judges and Ruth, you have to think about the civil war taking place between David's forces and those in line with Benjamin while this is all taking place. Samuel's a prophet, and he's saying, no. David's not a usurper, right? David's the true king. In fact, God's been working on this for the last 3 generations. Let me tell you how. Todd?
The other thing is talking about God's providence. It also shows you when you look all the way back and see the promises of God starting, particularly with Judah. And he says, line of Judah is going to come, referring to Christ. And as you go through, you start seeing these stake marks in these books of where you go, oh, this makes sense now because God's planning for this because Christ is going to come out of Judah, so he has to have a king. So, and you just start seeing these stake marks, and it's like anything else. If you start in Genesis and read, you can miss it. And then when you see when Jesus comes, then you go back and then you start seeing all these little landmarks that God has placed in the history.
And just like with Judah, right, and Tamar have Perez, in Genesis 49, whenever Joseph is giving the blessing to his children, what does he say about Judah? The scepter shall not depart Judah, right? Scepter is obviously what the king has. And so by that emphasis of Perez right there at the very end gives those illustrations of, like what you just said, the prophecy that Jacob gives to Judah about the king, right? So you see all this revolve. The very beginning, you have Elimelech, my God is king. The very end, you have King David, right? And so, and then, and time again in the book of Judges, what does it say? There was no king in Israel, right? And so you see this idea of kingship, you can miss it, but in Judges and Ruth, the word king is very important. It appears, lots of times. And then you think about what's taking place while this is going on, you're like, oh, okay, that makes more sense to me now, right? And so, good comments. Well, thank you guys so much. Let's go ahead and let's close in a prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for this day you've given to us. We're thankful for all the blessings that we have. We're thankful for this time to come together inside this warm building and be able to read and study your word. We're so thankful for your servants, Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz, and for their example of faithfulness and putting their faith and trust in you and working hard and trusting your providential care. Dear Heavenly Father, please help us to follow their example. Help us to show loving kindness to those around us, especially in the household of faith. Help us to be individuals who are faithful and who look to you as the giver of every good gift and the giver of all of our blessings. Help us, dear Heavenly Father, to show that loving kindness to others and to let them know that we do indeed have a Redeemer who has given us a new life. We're so thankful for that. We pray all this through Christ's name. Amen.